Hi everyone, so today we are going to read the book, The Power of Her Pen. It says the story of the groundbreaking journalist, Ethel L. Payne. So I'm wondering what the power of her pen means. Ethel Lois Payne always had an ear for stories. Her grandparents' front porch stories of Kentucky cotton fields and Tennessee auction blocks. Her parents' kitchen table stories of northbound trains from sharecroppers' plots. Long past her bedtime, Ethel collected the stories of people who followed a path paved with dreams. So when people would tell her a story, she would write it into her notebook. In 1911, the year Ethel was born, her father, William, worked as a pullman porter on a railroad, helping passengers with their luggage and serving them in dining cars on trains that crisscrossed the country. He tossed bundles of newspaper called the Chicago Defender onto train platforms, spreading news of jobs and hoped for blacks and segregation in the South. Ethel didn't see blacks in the segregated South. Ethel didn't see her daddy much, but his firm hand ruled from a distance. He and her mama, Bessie, a Latin teacher, filled their home with an equal measure of discipline and love. On Saturdays, once the house was spotless, Bessie took Ethel and her 5 siblings to the white side of town, where there were libraries with shelves, stacked tall with books. There, Ethel flipped through the pages and memorized passages to recite to anyone who would listen. And if you can see here, it says Chicago Public Library. One month after Ethel started high school, her father came home from a long run on the railroads and took to bed sick with a headache. The house was hushed. The doctor was called, but nothing could be done. After William passed, Bessie worked hard to make ends meet. Ethel walked a mile to school each day. The neighborhood residents screamed and yelled and threw rocks at a black girl who dared to go to school with the whites. Sometimes I stood my ground. Sometimes I got a bloody nose from fighting. But that was the way it was, Ethel later recalled. So making ends meet means just making enough to survive, to get food and to keep her house. And so at this time in history, there was segregation, and so there were places where white people could go and places where black people could go, and things weren't very fair. And so I think that Ethel right now is trying to make a difference in her community. Ethel spent her school days daydreaming of a life far beyond her neighborhood, except when she was in English class. There, her teacher, Miss Dixon, encouraged her writing. Her mother encouraged her at home. Ethel wrote during the day, and she read her stories aloud to her family at night. The school wouldn't let a black student work on the school newspaper. But after reading Ethel's writing, it did publish her very first story. During the Great Depression, with money even tighter than before, Ethel attended a local college with free tuition and took writing classes. So the Great Depression was a time when a lot of people struggled with money and keeping their homes. And so think about before, they were already struggling to make ends meet. Now we have the Great Depression where there's not a lot of jobs. And so Ethel was lucky. She got a full ride to college and she worked hard. When World War II began, the United States fought overseas while Ethel fought against racism and injustice in her own backyard. She started by organizing a women's social group at her church to make improvements in her community. Then she started a story hour for children. Next, she started a scholarship fund. So a scholarship could be to go to school, well, they'll help pay for you, and they're also working to have a group together so that they're going against injustices, saying that with these 2 different groups where only white people can go, that's not right, and we need to make a difference in our community. After battling long and hard in Chicago, Ethel set her sights on politics in Washington, D.C., and began writing letters to newspapers commenting on unjust laws and discrimination against blacks. I was beginning to have the seeds of rebellion churning up in me, Ethel later said. By the time World War II ended in 1945, Ethel was aching to see a world far beyond the south side of Chicago. She got the chance when she answered a newspaper ad for a job overseas. With her mother's blessing, she was on her way to Tokyo, Japan. Ethel set off to explore, filling page after diary page with her observations and experiences. Some of the pages she devoted to stories of Black soldiers. Life as a club social director on the U.S. military base kept her busy, organizing activities for these soldiers. But she noticed that even in Japan, Black American soldiers who fought alongside American soldiers who were white had separate promoted. Ethel never imagined her voice would be soon heard in the United States all the way from Japan. So she's noticing injustices even in the military. Ethel showed her diary entries to a friend, a reporter who was on assignment in Japan. With Ethel's permission, he shared her writing with his editor back in Chicago. Her sister was the first to call it the news. One of Ethel's articles about Black soldiers stationed in Japan had made its way across the seas and into the newspaper headlines, which were now in the hands of thousands. I think I'm seeing how powerful her pen is now, right? So just by writing, she was able to reach so many people. When her job in Japan ended in 1951, Ethel returned to her home, her family, and a job offer from the Chicago Defender, one of the only two Black newspapers in the country, and the main source of news in the Black community. It celebrated the births, graduations, marriages, and retirement news of its Black citizens. Ethel once joked, "You couldn't grow up in Chicago and be Black if you didn't know the Chicago Defender." So here she is working at the Chicago Defender. As the features reporter, Ethel wrote about housing, jobs, healthcare, and community events. After 1 year, Ethel and her notebook headed to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where politicians debated civil rights. As more and more readers opened their newspapers to read the articles written by Ethel L. Payne, the Defender's circulation grew. After 3 years, her editor asks, "Why don't you go down to Washington?" Of the 204 reporters, Ethel was only one of 3 Black journalists issued a White House press pass. It allowed her to sit in the Treasury Room of the White House, where the president met with journalists. Only when the president nodded could a reporter ask a question. These experienced reporters knew how to jump to their feet, hoping their voices would be the ones to reach the president's ear. So wow, there's 204 reporters and only 3 of them are Black. And so she's now in there trying to learn how all of this works. How do I get my question answered by the president? At first, Ethel sat waiting. Then she stood. Then she waited more. Finally, President Dwight D. Eisenhower turned to Ethel and nodded. "Mr. President," Ethel began shakily. "Mr. President," she looked down at her carefully written question and asked the president's views on a racial incident that occurred at the White House. So there was a racial incident at the White House. She wants to know how the president feels about this. U.S. Negro reporter draws Ike's wrath, a headline screamed. But Ethel kept asking questions. The white press was so busy asking questions on other issues that the Blacks and their problems were completely ignored. She later recalled, she asked how the president planned to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling of the Brown versus the Board of Education case, which outlawed segregation. "I wish that all people could understand what we went for our children, the same rights as any other human being," she later explained. So in this case, a student wanted to be able to attend an all-white school. They said there's not segregation laws anymore. A Black student should be able to attend a white school. And so she wanted to know how the president felt about this. When Eisenhower left office in 1961, Ethel asked the young President John F. Kennedy about his civil rights voting record. When Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, she asked Lyndon B. Johnson about the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Act. And then she asked Richard M. Nixon questions about the lack of Blacks in his administration, and Jimmy Carter questions on education. Ethel spent so much time in the White House, she earned the title of First Lady of the Black Press. So here are all the presidents going in order who she was interviewing. Outside the White House, Ethel interviewed protesters in Montgomery, Alabama, and Little Rock, Arkansas, and marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Somebody had to do the fighting because somebody had to speak up, Ethel later declared. Writing stories of the protesters' struggles was her way of doing just that. For nearly 5 decades, Ethel fought long and hard to bring attention to the issues that mattered most to her country, and became the voice of those who had none. Ethel wrote the stories that the mainstream media refused to. It was her questions to presidents that finally made readers of all races pay attention to the plight of African Americans. Her reporting highlighted their struggles for justice, equal pay, housing, and education. And in her role of informing her readers, Ethel created awareness and activism in the fight for civil rights for people across the globe. So here you can see the names of important African Americans who made a difference. So there's Rosa Parks, Dorothy Height, she was in education, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, and so she's recording these stories for these people. Always an ear for stories, Ethel asked the questions and demanded the answers for people whose paths were paved with dreams. "I've had a box seat on history," Ethel once said, and that's a rare thing. So a box seat, if you were at a play, would be up high, so you'd be like looking in. So she's saying, I've been able to view history as it's been going on, and so this is a rare thing. Not many people have been able to do that. And so here is Ethel in real life. And I like this story because it shows how powerful your words can be. And that if you speak up for something that you don't think is fair or is right, that you can make a difference. And that's just what Ethel did with the power of her pen. Thanks, guys.